Welcome to Beyond the Bee, an ongoing dialogue about the past, present, and future of the B Corp movement. Co-hosts Emmy Allison and Ryan Honeyman facilitate an open and honest conversation about the B Corp movement, advise companies on how to increase their impact, and provide a deep dive into the new B Corp standards that are shaping our community. Our guest today is Sara Gifford. Sara is the COO and co-founder of ActiVote. The company's mission is to empower every voter to be informed and feel confident to vote in every election. ActiVote focuses on reaching into low-propensity voting communities to ensure that they have the opportunity to participate in the process. Sara, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Could you tell us a little bit about your background, maybe before you first got involved with the B Corp movement?
Sure. So I've spent my whole life in technology, a geek since birth kind of thing, and went up from there. I spent most of my career before the B Corp movement working for a supply chain optimization company. And what was great about that is we built and deployed software, at gigantic companies across the world. And on the one hand, what we did and how we optimized, their processes would save them money, but it also had amazing, environmental impacts or people impacts. And so if we can make DHL trucks drive fewer miles all over the world, that's also less carbon that goes into the atmosphere, right? And it can be a win-win, right? The company gets something they're looking for and the environment and the world gets something they're looking for. If we can make better schedules for air traffic controllers for the FAA, on the one hand, that makes us all safer when we're flying, if they're working well rested and whatnot, but it's also making a great employee situation, right? For the people there that are, being accurately scheduled for the union and the labor laws, that they're supposed to be working under. And so one of the things I realized kind of through all of that is like, wow, business really can be a force for good. Yes, we're making money. Yes, we're paying our employees. Yes, we're doing all these great things, but we're also at the same time having a positive impact. And so when I kind of moved on from there, it made me realize like I can make sure that's always a focus of a thing I'm doing is to do good while, also being part, of the economy that we're all working in.
That's so cool. Yeah, supply chain optimization is such an interesting, you get to touch so many aspects of our lives.
It's cool to be a part of seeing how all these different parts of your world work, right? So many of us take for granted so many things, right? You go to the grocery store and there's food on the shelves. Well, how did it get there? How did it get from the farm to the factory, to the truck, to the warehouse, to the grocery store, to the shelves, right? How do these big shipping containers work that get your car, right, from one place to another? How do, all of these things that we don't think about. And what's interesting is, people started talking about it in COVID because supply chains were disrupted, right? It was one of the first times, I'd been doing it for 20 years, but it's the first time that the world kind of realized, oh, wow, our whole world runs on this supply chain. And when they break, we all feel it. And, and if you look, some of the inflation we feel today is still the aftermath of a broken supply chain getting itself back together. And so I'm incredibly grateful that I had that opportunity to just kind of see and learn how so much of the world works.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. When did you first learn about the B Corp movement and how did you first get involved?
So when I started ActiVote with my co-founders, we knew that we were kind of flipping the script, right? The previous company we had started together was really, we're going to make a company, we're going to try to make money. And then, hey, oh, by the way, we can do good. And this one was like, hey, we're going to do kind of the same thing, but opposite. We just want to do good. We want to figure out how to help voters. And then if we can figure out how to make a company out of it, that's great. But with that, we knew we didn't want to take donations because we knew we never wanted to ask voters for money. If anyone has ever been involved in anything in politics, there are a lot of people already asking you for money on text, on phone call, on email, on everywhere. And so we knew that wasn't going to be a part of it. And so we weren't going to be a nonprofit because we didn't want donations. So we were going to be a real company, but we wanted to make a different statement this time. We didn't want it to be the afterthought that we were doing good, kind of like the supply chain thing. And I don't want to call it an afterthought because we did a lot of good there. Yeah. And I don't want to minimize the impact we had. But this time we wanted, we knew it was going to be part of the DNA that we wanted to have as a company. And so when we started looking around, we're like, okay, but how can we be that, right? And I actually found, the B Corp movement actually through some of your voter outreach you did in 2020, where B Lab did a bunch of very specific outreach and, encouraged companies to give people time off to vote, encouraged, all this whole thing. And I realized I was like, oh, I can be part of that movement, right? And then when I started reading more about it, I was like, oh, this is exactly who we are. So it wasn't hard for us to have bylaws that said, put the world first, right? And put your social impact first. We were already doing it. It was just some paperwork to make it, official. And, treating people well was always part of who we've been, forever. And so it gave us a place where, yep, we can still be a company that's out there in the world, but kind of that official badge of goodness, makes you feel really good. And so I was thrilled to have found, B Lab and this whole movement because it fit who we were and what we were trying to do so perfectly.
That's so cool. What have been your experiences with the B Corp movement so far?
So, it was interesting. Your first entry into it is this whole assessment thing, which I don't think anybody would ever say is fun, to do. But I appreciate the rigor, right? If you're going to have a label that means something, then there needs to be rigor to apply that label. While it wasn't fun, I really appreciated it. And it also gave us chances to think about things we hadn't thought about. So in that sense, we had to make some policies that we'd had in our heads, but we hadn't made official. And so in some ways, it was a great process to really learn and look at, hey, exactly who do we want to be? And let's really kind of solidify that and codify that in writing. I was actually floored when we got our certification to be welcomed into this community with a portal where you can talk to other people, where you can see what other people are doing, where they're sharing resources. It ended up being much more of a community than I had expected going in. And that was a really pleasant surprise. I thought it was just going to be, okay, we get this label and you move on and you do what you want with it. But it wasn't that. I made a little video for our website when we got accepted and I posted it on social media and a bunch of B Corp shared it. And I was like, that's crazy. Like, you don't even know who I am, And so I think for me, one of the best surprises was that there is an actual community and there is a place to kind of reach out to people and be part of it, kind of in it as far as you want. My impression is I could do even more with it than I'm currently doing. And it's kind of a grab bag for as much or as little as any company wants.
Could you walk us through what the ActiVote app does?
Yeah, so the essence of ActiVote is that we are trying to help make engaged and informed citizens who participate in every single election. So at its core, you can go in and plan your vote, right? So if I'm talking to you right now, probably the thing I want to talk to you about is you go in, you put in your address, and you can plan your vote. We'll give you updates on early voting, absentee voting, how to mail in your ballot if you want to go that way. We'll tell you everything that's on the ballot. We'll help you figure out, hey, who believes what I believe? There's a public policy quiz, kind of like the dating app for politics, to see which candidates share your values. It can be really helpful in nonpartisan races when they aren't color-coded already for you. We will keep you up to date with legislation, who represents you. We have a lot of depolarizing activities you can go through. All of it is wrapped in tiny little actions. So you get a 3-minute action each day. You don't have to sit down for 5 hours and play politics. A lot of people are not into that. 3 minutes a day. 3 minutes a day, and you will have everything you need for the upcoming election. And the great news is we will be here the day after the election as well. We are not leaving you after you vote. We're going to stay with you kind of through that whole thing. And so we gamify it, badges and streaks and, confetti that drops. I'll leave you to figure out when that confetti drops in your app sells, but it is there for you. And I think what's important, we don't sell your data. Your data is private. I know politics is personal. Politics is very personal to everybody kind of out there. So we are not taking it and selling that data off so that someone can come sell you something. It stays personal and private to you.
Yes, one of my favorite things about ActiVote is that users are really building their civic engagement muscles and becoming, just generally more informed.
In your experience, why do people not vote?
I think there's a lot of reasons. If you look at the reason that seems to get the biggest headlines, it's like voters are apathetic. And I think that's total garbage. I have not met a single person in the world, actually, that doesn't care about their friends, their family, their house, their community, the school their kids go to, right? Everybody cares about all of this stuff. And people know, how this system works. It's just really hard. And I think it's hard for a lot of different reasons, right? It can be hard, if you work every Tuesday and your state only has elections you can only vote on election day and you happen to work from, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. That's really hard. But it's also hard because the process makes people feel stupid. And how many voluntary things do you want to participate in that make you feel bad? And what I mean by that, we did a huge focus group because we work specifically with low propensity voting communities to ask this question, right? What is hard about this and how can we make it better? And that was one of the biggest things is like, it just makes me feel dumb. Did you know that this is on the ballot? No, I didn't, but thanks for making me feel bad about it, right? You should vote for your county recorder because it's really important. Well, I don't know what that is and who that is, what they are, what they do, and why I should care. And so I think part of the hard, it's not apathy. That information is really hard to get to. At the time we were starting ActiVote, I was moving. And so I had to figure out an entirely new state's elections, a whole new state legislature, a whole new city government, a whole new politics. The number of 1980s websites I bumped up upon trying to figure this stuff out. And we say this is easy. Like, I think people don't vote because it's actually pretty difficult. And it's difficult not just mechanically, it's difficult to know what's on the ballot and feel good about it. And when you're asking someone to do volunteer work, you should make them feel good about it. So that's my 2 cents. And I just happen to refuse to believe the apathy argument.
It is difficult to vote, and it's really difficult, to figure out where to begin. We are so inundated too with all of this information, and yet it still doesn't make complete sense. So yeah, it is quite difficult.
For me, when I'm thinking about who I'm going to vote for, the candidates that are there on the table versus like where it seems like we need to go, like the sort of like distance between like where my values are and then like what's being presented as the two candidates. How do you reconcile with the maybe voter apathy or people who are feeling like I'm actually overwhelmed because it's like so far off from where I want to be engaged?
One of the things I tell voters is I'll tell voters a few things. So one, if at some point you have a goal of running a marathon, you don't start by running 20 miles. You start by running 1 mile, and your running 1 mile might be walk for 10 seconds, run for 10 seconds, walk for 10 seconds, run for 10 seconds. And then at some point in time, you're running a marathon, right? And the process of getting from I can't run at all to I've just run a marathon is not short, filled with disappointments, maybe some injuries, and all of that. But many, 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 many people can get there. If we look, and I think our democracy is the same thing, right? If you go back 100 years to where we are, I mean, if you truly look at the state of policies back then, we would all be so disgusted. But we didn't get from 100 years ago till today in one big sweeping change. We got there by a bunch of incremental change, a few setbacks, a bunch of incremental change, a few setbacks, some big change, right? And then a couple setbacks, and you move forward. And so I tell people a lot of times when they think about voting and they think about this, is like, yes, it's frustrating. And yes, you might not be getting everything you want, but don't sacrifice incremental progress for that greater goal, because it is the only way things have ever gotten done. Because the only other version, when people want a big, grand, sweeping change, it's war. That is the big, grand, sweeping change. That's how it happens. There's a gigantic political unrest and war. And I don't think there's anyone in America that's cheering for that. And so I feel you, but I truly do. But I think that would be my message to people is small change isn't no change. And many of the big things that have happened have come through thousands of small changes. I don't know if it makes you feel better, but that's my message.
It does. Sometimes I need to be walked back off the ledge a little bit. You see big changes like, the Dobbs decision, like removing abortion rights in many states, federally, and then many states have enacted it, restrictions on abortion. But that was small steps Republicans were planning for many, many, many years. So that wasn't just like, oh, it just happened. And then so there is examples. And one more question, maybe before moving on to some of the other B Corp questions, is around what have you identified in terms of psychology of engagement from your app? So this could apply to people in any country, in any region. Like, what are you noticing about, like, how do you get people off the couch or like to be engaged? And like, what sort of like tips or piece of advice might you offer for people, regardless of where they are, to sort of get some more engagement around voting?
So one of the very conscious choices that we made was, if you want people to do something, make it about them, not about you. And part of this came from experience. For anyone that's been active politically, you've probably knocked on doors. And I knocked on a door at one point, and this woman came to the door, and I was advocating for my candidate that I was volunteering for at the time. And this woman came to the door, and she was very polite but very firm that she wanted me to go away. And she's like, "You don't care about me. You show up once every 4 years." And she meant the broader you, someone for this campaign. You show up every 4 years and you ask me for my vote, and then I don't hear from you, and a single day in between, go away. I will do what I want to do. And so I was like, do I put you down for a maybe? And I left. But she was right. She was right. I knocked on her door asking for something. I want something for my candidate. I want you to show up and you to do something. And I want you to do it for my guy, right? My girl in that case. And so what we have done, and part of it from that experience, is like, everything we do is not for us. It's not for a campaign. It's not for the government. It's not for anything. It's for the voter. If you truly make someone feel that this thing is for them, they are more likely to want to engage with it. because selfish is a bad word, but it's the thing that I can do for myself. And so we have painted voting and public policy and engagement and civics all as a personal thing that you are doing for yourself. And by doing that, it is empowering. Voting is one of the most powerful things you can do. My city had a city council election, and it was decided by a single vote. The winner was decided by one vote. I voted in that election. I decided that election. So did 40,000 other people, but I also decided that election, right, by my single vote. And so voting is an incredibly powerful thing. And if you can phrase things that way and structure things that way about the person, you're more likely to be successful from an engagement perspective.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's so interesting too. And you're saying, yeah, how do we make it about voters and their friends and their family, to what you were speaking to earlier, like these policies affect people that they love. And I think you all have some great strategies as well. We have learned in recent election cycles that conversations with those loved ones and those people closest to you are the conversations that can move the needle the most. Could you speak a little bit more to that?
And I think this goes both for voting, but also when you talk about like the collective impact that we've been discussing, the best messenger is someone you already know and trust. I am not the best messenger for millions of Americans. They've never met me. They don't know who I am, and they don't know why in the world I'm here. But each of us knows people, our friends, our family, that you see. And if you are, known and trusted, when you ask for something, it carries more weight, right? So when I remind, and I am that annoying friend that reminds every single friend they have. I know which states all my friends live in. I know when their primaries are, and they're getting a call from me the week before. Say, hello, are you voting next week? And you know what? Some of them do it because they just don't want to have to say no to me. Some of them had already planned to do it, and that's great. We are the messengers. If we want people to vote, we should talk to people about voting. We should not be scared of it. But I think the same thing goes inside the B Corp movement, is if you want your employees to be passionate about something, be passionate about it and talk to them about it. If you think it would be great if your employees or your company did something, say something, right? Your manager might have never thought about it. Give them the idea, be that impetus of change. And so I think we each individually are kind of powerful in this collective by the force of our voice and the force of our own passion. When I was a young nothing, my first company didn't have recycling, and I made sure they did because I was a recycling geek. And for the first 6 months, I physically took it home in my car to recycle it in my town dump because that's the only way it would work. And I was like, I'm going to do it. I'm happy to do it. And this was a company of 12 people. So did I change the world? No. But did I feel really good about it? Yes. And so, we can all be that. And it's much the same way in voting, I think, as it is for anything you want to try to do inside your company for the collective good.
One thing that I've heard campaigns talk about is, and maybe you've even spoken about it too, is the margins in a deeply polarized country. And I imagine many countries listening to this, it's like the marginal margin. It's like the very small margins is what wins. And I'm curious, what is your take on why are these small, tiny margins really the things that are turning elections? And maybe that's partially because I think in the US, it's like 50% of people don't vote, right? Like that's just off the top. So then you have, then you have 25, basically it's like 24% versus 24. And then you have like 2% that decides. But can you speak to anything about who are these marginal voters and what are you seeing for the upcoming election? And are there different trends or anything you want to speak about?
Yeah, I mean, you're right? So 2020 was probably the best participation election we've had. And it was about 66% of Americans voted, right? And so when you look at an election that was decided by, 8 million votes, 7 million votes, at least in the popular vote, much less than that. If you get into all the details of the Electoral College, let's just talk about the 7 million votes. There's 330 million Americans, 220 million voting eligible Americans. 33% of those didn't vote. That's 30 million Americans. 40 million Americans. So it was decided by the people who didn't vote, right? And so I think when you think about the margin, in these elections, yes, it is swing voters, quote unquote, swing voters that are going to move that one way or the other, but it is also who shows up, right? A lot of these elections are no more about swing voters. It is about participation, right? If you go back, the first year Obama got elected, he crushed it. And he crushed it not because of margins or swing voters or whatever. He inspired a group of voters that voted for either the first time or the first time in a long time. So he inspired turnout, and turnout won that election. And if you look, Hillary didn't inspire that turnout. People stayed home. She didn't lose because she was a better or worse possible person, candidate. Trump inspired turnout. So Trump did what Obama did, right? He inspired people to show up. And then you know what? Biden in 2020 inspired people to show up. And they did it in different ways. Focus of their inspiration was pretty fiercely different, but they inspired people to turn up. So when we talk about the margins, it's not a margin of like, oh, I wonder what those people are going to do. I wonder it's who's going to stay home. Who are the 50 million Americans that are going to stay on the couch, right? And what can we do to get those people to show up? I don't know who they're all going to vote for, by the way. I don't. But I would be much more worried about the margins if everybody voted. Right now, the question is just, are enough people voting, and are the people like whose voices we need to hear kind of out there? And so that would be my answer. Probably not the one you wanted, but for me, it's about turnout, that it's not a margins election, it's a turnout election.
Right.
Yeah.
Energizing the base, things like that.
Yeah.
Energizing everyone. I mean, if you look at the past year, right? So you brought up Dobbs, Ohio, Kansas, huge ballot measures, off cycle, not November of an even year ballot measures about Dobbs, about abortion, and people showed up. They were inspired and they showed up. And the turnout, I don't have the stats off the top of my head. I'm happy to look them up for you afterwards, but amazing turnout for the type of election that it was. It's a turnout election. That's my
throwing random politics questions at you now because I mean, you're a great person to ask this. One thing that I get particularly frustrated about is the way that political parties motivate their voters is often framing the other party as a catastrophe that is like possibly the worst thing that ever happens. You know, for Democrats, it's Trump is fascism. It's like a return to fascism. Like we're going to fascism if Trump's reelected. And then for Republicans, it's maybe like the sort of the left will take us to communism, you know, or it'll be like a catastrophic wasteland. So the political parties know how to energize people, but ultimately it is like creating deeper polarization. And so what are some ways that you've seen of like, how do you energize people without necessarily framing it as like, this is a devil versus a normal person, or like, any thoughts on that?
In my opinion, the essence of all of that is social media, right? If you go back to the 80s and the 90s before social media, what we still had back then is if it bleeds, it leads. If anyone in the media has ever heard that quote, why? Because on the front page of every newspaper was something bloody, right? Something dramatic, something scary, something, you know. And so that sentiment hasn't changed in 50 years, right? If it bleeds, it leads. The problem is in social media, that happens every fraction of a second, right? So there have been studies about what trends on social media. And there have been some famous people, the Captain America guy, the actor, you know, put out only positive stuff for a while, right? And just didn't get retweeted. Never. Because if it bleeds, it doesn't lead, right? It wasn't getting the traction. It wasn't, the algorithms weren't picking it up. It wasn't putting it out. And so part of the problem is, you know, is the problem the politicians saying the stuff, or is the problem the algorithms only promoting the ugly stuff? And therefore politicians who want to get elected are trying to, you know, you play the channels you have. And so do we blame them for that? I would argue yes. But do you also blame the reason that they're doing it, which is social media is only amplifying the stuff, and they need social media to win. That's how you reach people these days. And so my answer to this question is regulation, social media regulation. Finding the fairness doctrine version of social media. We used to have, and of course that left when Reagan pulled it out in media, we used to have the fairness doctrine that ensured that media was less partisan. When that got ripped out, media got more partisan, right? We might need that back on television as well, but then we need the social media version of it to help, you know, change what gets amplified.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Media is very much amplifying a lot of our issues, and also just, you know, further underlines the importance of independent media and media, small media, local media. And there's obviously still issues in those areas as well. But
it also gives us a chance as B Corps. What do we amplify internally, right? So if at the beginning of every company-wide meeting, we share a positive story from our community, from our industry, from our world, right? We can start combating that with tiny, small things. You know, we start every meeting with some sort of story of something we heard. Was it a voter who reached out? Was it an issue that got reported? Was it a review that we got, you know, somewhere? We start everything with something positive. Every team meeting is with one positive thing. Different people talk about it and different people do it. But like, I think there's ways that we can start combating that inside our own B Corps.
You mentioned a little bit earlier that a key piece of legislation was removed, and that is part of why our media is so biased. I'm curious if there are any particular policies? What are some of the more substantial policies that we could advocate for as B Corps to ensure that voters' votes matter?
That's a great question. I know that inside B Lab, there's a voting rights and voting education campaign this year about like what are the laws in your state, in your location, and how do we make that stuff work, right? So I think, access to voting is incredibly important. And so, early voting in states, no excuse absentee voting in states, I think those are powerful things that we can, be advocating for. I think if we look at the broader kind of set, if you're a company that's upset about the media, advocate for the fairness doctrine to come back or a version of it to come back, because it's probably quite dated. I think there's things that you can do there. I think if you're in the environmental space, right, there's a lot that you can be advocating for, in terms of, and one of the benefits of the environmental space is some of that can just be regulation instead of law, right? And getting regulations in place is a little bit easier than getting laws in place. But I think for some of this as well is to take it back to your own local community. The city I live in, I think it was only 3 or 4 years ago, finally got rid of plastic bags, right? You have to pay 5 cents if you want a plastic bag, right? If you're in the environmental space, that's a thing you can do at your local community level. You can advocate at your school board for more civics education. I think going back to what I mentioned earlier is to start small instead of just starting big. There's a lot of little things that you can do. You can volunteer to be a poll worker. Put all of these little things together. It really does drive change.
I love that. I heard you earlier say trying to identify what is working, doing it for the others, not for yourself. This is one story. I interviewed a guy named Tim Wise. He's an anti-racist organizer and a white guy. And he went to this, when he was like in his 20s, he went to this Black community in New Orleans. He was really excited about how do we organize and like mobilize this community to like advocate. And they're like, dude, we want a stop sign on like the street right here because people are flying through the street and like hitting people. And so he was like, what? But like, we need to like organize and like overthrow that, they're like small steps. And they got the stop sign, but then that built trust and like led to more action. I really resonate with, recommendation and your experience with seeing small steps be the way to go. I think I'm just impatient and get frustrated easily.
You mean you're speaking to the choir? I think we all do. One of the benefits of small steps is they sometimes go faster, right? It's a lot faster to get a stop sign than it is to pass federal legislation, right? It's a lot faster to get, one civics seminar at the high school your kid goes to for 45 minutes for only seniors than it is to, change the school schedule, right? A lot of these smaller things can also go much faster. And it also gives you that dopamine hit of a win. And a lot of those small things, like a stop sign is a great example, probably a pretty bipartisan request, and doesn't tap into that anger, that we are all a little bit sick of.
That's a fun example because my block.
You have some personal experience with that?
Yeah, it's fully relatable. And like, we got the stop sign installed. I don't know who advocated for it, but I can absolutely vouch for the fact that the entire neighborhood was so pumped about it. Like, we were very actively excited about it for several weeks. We got a new stop sign. We slowing people down, people just ripping through the intersection. So can relate.
Sara, as we're moving towards, the last couple questions here, one of the things we've been asking folks is, how are you trying to be more like a B Corp in your personal life? Because we all like work at companies and aspire to create them as high impact, but how are you sort of living the sort of B Corp ethos or values in your personal life?
I think that it's a lot of little things. And I don't know what came first. I don't know if me as a person came first or the B Corp part came first, right? Or they just happily go together. One of the things, during COVID, so I live in an apartment building, with a bunch of other people. And so during COVID, I would go get groceries for some of the elderly people, right? They take a list. I was less scared as a slightly younger person and I would go get groceries. I still do that. I realize like, oh, it's not COVID now, but the grocery store is 3 blocks away and you're 85. Like, I can still go to the grocery store, right? And, for me, it's good for my steps. It's good for my health, right? Might meet my step goal for the month, right? A win. And for them, it's a lovely win, as well. And so I think sometimes the tiniest little actions for you make a big difference to someone else. And I think that's part of also what that B Corp spirit is, right? Like, how hard is it to have, a good ethics policy? It's actually not that hard, because in 99.9% of cases, everyone, adheres to it anyway. Just make it something you commit to, right? And so there's many, many things in a company that are not hard to do if you just decide to do it. But the same thing goes here, right? And so there's so many little things that I try to do. And, kind of going with the theme is it's a lot of little things. Because one, it makes it easier for me to repeat. And I think people underestimate the value of repetition and the value of consistency. And small is easier to do. It doesn't make it less meaningful, right, to the people that benefit from it.
I love that. Sarah, what do you need right now?
So I think for me, for anyone listening, my ask would be that you just think about the upcoming election in November. What are you going to do to engage your employees, maybe even your customers? If you need resources, we probably have them. But the most effective way, like we mentioned earlier, to get someone to vote is that they hear from someone they know and trust, and it's probably you. And if we think about it and we think about the power of the B Corp collective, so let's just start with, what if every employee at every B Corp voted? Right? That could change a race. That could change, if your company is in a specific, state house district, it could change who's elected for state house, right? Which could change control of the state house, which could change your entire state politics, right? By one office showing up to vote. If you're across the country, you could change school boards across the country. You could change mayors across the country. You could do all these things. And so, what if everyone at your company voted? And even better, what if everyone at your company got 3 other people to vote? And some of that is just by making it known and making it aware. Put a sign up in the office, right? Just put the election date up, maybe put the polling location up, or put a link up. If you need one, I can give you one, for how to find this stuff. That's what I need from anyone listening. And if you're listening from abroad, if you know any Americans, talk to them, because they probably need a hint from you as well.
I'm curious, is there a book that you gift to folks when you want to give gifts out?
My favorite book that I give as gifts, especially kind of in this business space, is Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin. It's about Abraham Lincoln, who many of us probably know from our American history education. But the part of the book that really resonates with me is that it's about leadership. He appointed a cabinet, which was a team of rivals, because he wanted different perspectives. Imagine how much better our country could be today if different voices were listened to in a calm way. You can disagree without being disagreeable, and bringing the best of all of it together. So it's a lot about leadership, how to be a great leader, how to be an inspiring leader, and how to bring about change. And if you look, Abraham Lincoln certainly had a history of bringing about some positive change.
How can we learn more about your work?
So we actually have a B Corp version. So if you go to acti.vote/be a voter, you will get the B Corp version of ActiVote for everybody out there and plan your vote.
That's so cool. I did not know that. I'm so excited to check it out.
I will put a link in the chat, or you guys can put a link underneath it afterwards as well.
What does that even mean, a B Corp version of the app?
Oh, you might have to play with it and find out.
I love it.
A nice cliffhanger.
Well, thank you, Sarah. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. And maybe one last question. Is there other, I was once involved with like Braver Angels and some of the depolarizing. Are there any other groups or orgs that people should also just be aware of in this space of like increasing engagement, but also sort of like depolarizing the work?
I mean, Braver Angels is a great one. They set up red-blue conversations so you can talk to somebody different. And it's I have actually done 54 of them for myself, right? As part of my own mission to be, an accepting and open and educated person, and understanding that there are different perspectives than my own. So Braver Angels is a great one for people who are ready to engage with others. There are other, though, resources that you can use that are less. Doing a one-on-one conversation can be really daunting, because you're going to feel like you need to know a lot about a lot of things to feel comfortable having that conversation. There are some great videos and exercises you can go through on your own. The Moral Foundations framework out there about, value systems and why people make decisions they have. And so there's quite a few of those. And I'm happy to send a list of resources for people who aren't ready to make the leap for a one-on-one conversation, but where you can do small exercises around depolarization. We have some of them even incorporated into our app.
That's so cool. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you so much for coming on today, Sarah. It's been really lovely having you on, being able to grill you with lots of political questions.
Thank you. And I'm really excited about the new framework, some of the collective action requirements that B-Lab is coming up with.
We are too. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Bee. We are trying to grow our audience and wanted to ask you a huge favor that you can do right now. Try to think of one person that might like this show. Then pull out your phone and text them something like, "Hey, I think you might like this new podcast, Beyond the Beat. Check it out at lifteconomy.com/beyond. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Seriously, try to text someone right now. Pull out your phone. Then follow up with them to see how they liked it. This would be super helpful for us. We deeply appreciate your support.